You are listening to the Necropolis podcast, which is brought to you by Jason from Goatcraft and Shelly from HateMeditations.com and Metal magazine.
Welcome to Necropolis. We are 3 weeks running now with these tier lists here. And today we got a very special one. We're doing 1991 death metal. And what a great year that was. So we have the usual suspects back today. We have Shelly from the website HateMeditations.com and Metal magazine. Hello, Shelly.
I apologize about my covert sigh there. I'm passive aggressively looking at this tier list. Oh wow, there's so many great and bad albums. Well, thank you for having me.
And Shelly appears to have been kidnapped by Mickey Mouse or something there. And we also have Tyler, the one and only, back again. Hello, Tyler.
Hey, Jason. It's nice to be back on Necropolis.
Good to have you as always. And I am Jason, aka Lone Goat, from the Necroclassical project Goatcraft. Alrighty, let's get into it. So the first album is Asphyx, The Rack. I can't keep that up much longer. I'm going to need way more beer.
Yeah. I do have an energy drink, so that's probably why it sounded like Mickey Mouse trying to sound like shit.
Oh, I thought you had to take a second to squeeze your balls to get up that high or something, but
yeah, I thought you would get a hoot out of the covert sigh there. The passive aggressive staring at the list. Sorry. Yeah, we do have Asphyx, The Rack, as the first, and that was horrible. We could have done so much better with that, changing the roles. But yeah, we have Asphyx, The Rack, a wonderful album. I do believe this is a timeless classic in some regards, but compared to some of the other releases on here, I am going to put it firmly as an A. I do love the aesthetic, especially the song The Rack is essentially the epitome of Asphyx. So, yeah, definitely an A for me. How about you, Mr. Shelley?
yeah, I think I would agree with an A in that it is definitely the best Asphyx album, one of the best of its kind in the sort of basic Death Doom oeuvre. But yeah, again, we're looking at the albums that we have before us. I think it's not quite as timeless as some of them. But yeah, in terms of what Asphyx were doing, the kind of the marriage of really, really basic component parts, like this is very kind of linear, straightforward death metal. The riffs are really simple. The songs are quite transparently constructed, but the complexity kind of comes from A, the delivery, and B, like the arrangements. And yeah, a lot of it's kind of like that down and dirty primitivism of a lot of, quite early death metal, maybe even sort of from the late 80s. But yeah, as you mentioned, like the title track, you get these grand sweeping moments that are almost, symphonic in their kind of epic ambitions, which really does kind of elevate this album beyond a lot of other Death Doom albums of a comparable kind of caliber. So yeah, I think it's a very strong A for me.
How about you, Tyler?
I also agree with giving it an A rank. I think that both in the context of Asphyx discography, as well as in comparison to death metal as a whole and death metal of this time, it pretty much has the position of being a spectacular, but sort of, how do I want to put this, quintessential death metal album. It does make a really good use in relation to their career in particular of the classic Asphyx sort of technique of sandwiching epic melodic riffs between like grinding percussive riffs. Does a fantastic job at that. I personally prefer the self-titled album as far as my favorite out of their discography. And if that was the album on the table, I would probably give it an S rank because I listen to it quite frequently. But this album is definitely excellent, just not what I would consider the best of the best, both in death metal and for Asphyx itself. So yeah, A is a good rank for me as well.
Wow, we all agree on the Asphyx. I never actually pronounce it with a hard A like you do, Tyler. It's always Asphyx. Or how'd you say it? Asphyx? Never mind. Next up is Atheist, Unquestionable Presence, and this is one album I've never been able to get into. I can appreciate it on fusing jazz with death metal sentiments, but I understand a lot of death metal riffs kind of have like jazzy chords here and there, and this elevates that aspect to just a sheer like jazz statement. But I would put it in the average territory. I think other bands have done this style a little bit better, like Demolic. I know you can't really compare the two. Like Atheist is like light jazz, and Demolic is like the most like crazy bombastic type of jazz under the death metal canon. So yeah, I'll put it Atheist as C. There's nothing inherently horrible about it to me. It's really not doing much for me. Like I said, the Demolic I would prefer for jazzy death metal. I know you guys are going to have a different opinion on this, so go ahead, Mr. Shelley.
Yeah, you're right. That hurts. This is one of my all-time favorite albums, and I think it is one of the peaks of not just death metal but metal itself. As a sort of testament to efficiency through quote-unquote progressive metal, I don't think it can be bettered. It's not just the fusion of jazz, progressive, and death metal, and to some extent, there's some classic thrash holdovers here. I mean, Atheist have been going for quite a few years before they arrived at this style. But I think it just puts all of the comparable progressive death metal elements to shame in whether that be Death or Pestilence or anything like that. The fact that this album is barely half an hour long, all of the tracks are about 3 or 4 minutes, but they managed to pack so much information, so much variety, but it flows like a stream of conscience. There really is nothing else like it to have come out of this scene and this movement. And it's almost the converse to Asphyx in a way, because it manages to sort of craft its own unique world with such an efficiency. I mean, obviously the Asphyx is very much more basic than what Atheist were doing, but there's a sort of intuitive transparency to what Atheist were doing here that is just so I don't know, unreal to me. It's one of those albums that I hold in such high regard that I actually do struggle to sort of articulate what it does. But yeah, it kind of almost ruined progressive metal for me, I think, in that any other band that is billed as progressive metal, I hold it up to this album and it just never stands up to the level of scrutiny that this album puts progressive metal to. So yeah, absolutely, undeniably an S tier for me.
Even like the proggy aspect of like At the Gates, you think it was better than
that? Yes, I would, but I never really considered At the Gates to be progressive with a capital P. So I'll clarify what I mean by that. Is there's a difference between sort of genre progressive, which would, that's like any music that's kind of influenced by or is an ancestor of 70s progressive rock in, King Crimson, Yes, and Genesis and so on. And then there's lowercase progressive, which is bands that make a clear point of progressing and developing their sound and sometimes engaging with complex musical forms, but not in the kind of explicitly esoteric way that progressive rock was doing and later progressive metal. So although At the Gates, you could say The Red in the Sky is Ours, and to some extent With Fear I Kiss the Burning Darkness are progressive, I'd call them lowercase p. I would say they are very, very unique forms of melodic death metal. That's how I'd sort of separate the two. But if we're talking about that, then At the Gates, I know they're not on offer here, but that would be an S tier album as well, their debut. But that's for another episode.
Yeah. Sorry, I guess my judgment was a little harsh placing it as a C. I mean, there's nothing in it that really offends me about the Atheist. It's just I just don't want to listen to it. It's just Tyler, go ahead.
I'm with Jason, or not Jason. I'm with Shelley on this one. This is absolutely one of my favorite albums of all time. I think that Atheist created entirely new palette of techniques and of voices and emotions for death metal to engage in. Their to repeat myself, the creativity on display here is absolutely phenomenal. It's an incredibly adventurous music. By expanding the palette available to them, they were able to take the development of their pieces and the development of what's considered typical for death metal as a whole into entirely unthought of realms. And both in the lead playing as well as in the riffing, they have a really good sense of transference of energy that keeps the excitement running high. And it really created a very powerful statement for their time that I think was never truly followed up on in the genre that came to be solidified as progressive death metal. Maybe some groups tried, like Pestilence to some extent, and Cynic, although I find Cynic to be a little bit limp-wristed, not nearly as exciting as Atheist, and Pestilence almost got there with Spheres, but not nearly on the level of power and ingenuity that Atheist had on this record. So yeah, this would be an S tier record for me.
Yeah, I'll just move it up to an A. I know it's just not a flavor of death metal that I enjoy. So,
I mean, to be honest, Jason, that doesn't surprise me. I never pegged you as a Atheist kind of guy, so I'm not offended that you've ranked it a C. Obviously, it's completely fucked up where it should be with the rank.
Yeah, I thought the same thing when he said C. I thought, well, that's not shocking at all.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's and I understand it's not everybody's cup of tea, but I think it's absolutely phenomenal. And I typically don't like really heavily progressive death metal albums. I'm very choosy with them as to whether they're good because they can oftentimes be very superficial, calling themselves progressive because they incorporate very like surface level, novel, quote unquote, aesthetic elements. But Atheist here, I think, nailed it.
All right. Yeah, I'll be kind and put it up to an A. Because I know my C kind of skewed the ratings here. So just as being a man of the people here, the people have spoken, and two people want it high, and one person's kind of indifferent towards it. So I'll just stick it as an A. Next one I do think is an A. The Autopsy Mental Funeral. This is what death should have been, in my opinion. Like Tyler was talking about how some bands are a little limp-wristy, with the proggy Pestilence and all that. I felt that death, is like death metal light, and Autopsy was more of the real deal. Even though I know Chris, the drummer, he was in Scream Bloody Gore, but I feel that he captured what the true expression was for death. Whereas less like comic booky, like on Scream Bloody Gore, and more visceral, and it's over the top, but it's not just for shock value like you have with the Cannibal Corpse. And there's like a death metal spirit in it, and yeah, definitely an A for me. So yeah, it looks like we're rating some of these albums out of the gate here rather high. So how about you, Shelley?
Yeah, no, I think I agree with A as well. What I love about this album is, again, the simplicity of it. Not just musically. I mean, it's not simple musically. There's a lot of diversity and a lot of color and a lot of life going on. But that's kind of what I like about it, is it feels very sincere and authentic and raw in a lot of ways. It's a very kind of honest expression of death metal in its rawest form. But on top of that, you could kind of locate it as death metal like reimagined through the lens of very early heavy metal. There's a clear Black Sabbath influence going on here with the doom elements. It's not trying to overwhelm the listener with a drone of chords in the way that an incantation would, or maybe even a six. The doom elements feel more creepy, sort of almost gothic in a way, and the thrashier elements feel sloppier and like almost aligned with punk in a lot of ways. And these things kind of speak to the sort of raw authenticity of the album. It's very kind of, I guess, blue collar is the word I'm looking for here. Is it's converse to Atheist, which is very esoteric and kind of brainy and trippy. Autopsy is the exact opposite, but in all the right ways in terms of its directness, its haunting kind of authenticity. And yeah, I kind of agree. It's sort of like a second run at Scream Bloody Gore, but just done right this time. I think that's quite a good way to characterize it. So yeah, A for me as well.
All right, Tyler.
In the last episode, I spoke of how Des Mysteries Dom Sathanas was a product of multiple characters within Mayhem and not necessarily solely a vision of Euronymous, and that's how it had higher quality than the rest of their discography. And talking about Scream Bloody Gore, I think the reason why, in my opinion, it's the best album in Death's discography is possibly because of the presence of Chris Reifert on the album. And I think that his talents were put to much better use in Autopsy. Their first two albums are just excellent examples of death metal, pretty much as everyone imagines it to be. And this album in particular actually engaged in some surprising twists and turns for an album that's just so thoroughly death metal and not really trying to be anything else. The Sabbath doom riffs that Shelley was mentioning, it's interesting because Autopsy does that in a way that you don't hear as transparently in other death metal groups, but you do hear that legacy carried on, especially even within other albums on this list. Swedish death metal had a huge influence from Autopsy, and that's not just something that you can hear when listening to it. That's something that they will readily admit. Anybody who's read Daniel Ekeroth's book Swedish Death Metal, he goes into length about the influence of Autopsy on Swedish death metal, and you can hear, especially in the demos of a lot of the big Swedish death metal bands, from Dismember to the pre-Entombed nihilist group and Unleashed, they also make use of those very simple, very doom, heavy moving power chord riffs that Autopsy makes use of. I wouldn't put it in an S tier simply because there's other albums even on this list that I feel deserve that ranking for really pushing the benchmark of what can be done within death metal, which Autopsy doesn't fully reach the levels of. But as far as an awesome album to listen to for a death metal album, you can't go wrong with Autopsy. So I agree with both of you that A tier is the perfect place for it.
All right.
Yeah, I think it's like it reaffirms the values of death metal and kind of takes stock and kind of combines it all into this really efficient package, as opposed, as you say, like as opposed to an album that pushes the boundaries. So yeah, I think that's a good way of like justifying why it belongs in A rather than S.
All right. Cancer, Death Shall Rise. So I remember hearing this band early on just because James Murphy, I believe, was in this band at one time. And I did revisit it recently. And the riffs are too cyclic. So I don't think, we've discussed a few times on this podcast that some albums have like an overarching intelligence or a view or a goal. And I don't feel that Cancer really has that. It's more of jamming out, creating cool riffs, and those riffs are just recycled through songs. And I don't view that there's a lot of real thought put into the overarching song structures at all. But I do view it as really energetic. Very good rhythms in there. But nothing that really stands out to me. So I'll put it as a C because I do view it as quite average. How about you, Shelley?
Yeah, so obviously I'm going to talk about uh, what's the word, geography in this, in that, as you can see from the list, we've got North America represented, we've got Sweden, as you'd expect from a death metal list, but God bless us in the UK. Like, we produced some really important metal bands over the years, but the two key genres to come out of the 80s, black metal and death metal, we just did not understand. Like, the best we could do was a Cancer or a Benediction. Well, yeah, Bolt Thrower as well, who are like the exception that proves the rule in a way. And they kind of came from the grind scene, which is where the UK's strengths really lay by the late 80s. But Cancer are kind of emblematic of the UK's contributions to death metal, and then it's not terrible. It's just a little bit flat, a little bit of a facsimile of better artists. I don't hate listening to Cancer, but I find myself just zoning out. Nothing really goes in. There's no, what's the word, like centerpiece. There's no showstopper for each track to kind of bind itself around, and the central focus that they work towards. It feels like they're going through the motions a little bit with a lot of this. So, I might even be harsh and say I think this is no better than a D, because at least some of the more terrible albums, I'm listening and I'm engaged as to why they're terrible, whereas this doesn't really hold my attention for any reason, which somehow makes it worse in a lot of ways.
So D.
Yeah.
Tyler.
Yeah, this album is incredibly boring. It sounds almost like Wasp on a bad day trying to sound like death metal. And it makes use of extremely predictable rhythmic progressions, really simple rock chord progressions on downtuned guitars almost. In talking about Benediction, Cancer almost makes Benediction look like Dismember. They don't do anything that makes them stand out. They have a lot of that plodding mid-tempo fare that is just incredibly lifeless. I've never understood why anybody would like this group, and also I don't know too many people who rant and rave about this that much. Honestly, it's never one that I see frequently come up in conversation. Occasionally somebody will name it as a classic, but it's not talked about nearly as much as the major classics of classic death metal. I wouldn't give it an F because Cannibal Corpse is much more deserving of that, as I see it's already creeping towards. But I would give it a D for not being anything noteworthy.
Oh wow, I was actually the nice guy on that one.
Yeah, I think they kind of, because they rode on the coattails of the Tampa scene, and they were like in Morrisound and stuff. They kind of, and they made a comeback recently. I say recently, it was a few years ago now, but where they kind of assumed that their legacy would be secure by the newfound love of old school death metal and stuff. And to some extent it was, but it was also quite clear that it's very clear in comparing them to some of the other artists that are more memorable within death metal what the difference is between a classic death metal album and just a competent one. And there was, like, by 1991 even, there was so many albums being released in this style that you had to really be pushing the envelope, which is why certain albums are remembered. And Cancer just weren't one of them. They were just, they had the Scott Burns kind of reputation to ride on a little bit. They, kind of had a little bit of a following in the UK, and, were able to tie in with other bands from around that time from the UK. But yeah, very undeserving. I think they would have been forgotten if they were from somewhere a little bit more off the beaten track, so to speak.
Yeah, all right. So they're positioned firmly in the D. Also, FYI, if you're listening on Spotify, the tier list is available on YouTube on the Hate Meditations channel for you guys to view. And see us put it together, and see in relationship with other albums how they're ranked. So I understand part of the logic that goes into placing things on a tier list is considering everything else has already been tiered. So and with that, I do view the Cancer as better than the Cannibal Corpse Butchered at Birth. So that's why I put it between a D and a F. I don't think it completely fails. I think it is perhaps Cannibal Corpse's strongest album, all around. But I tried listening to this yesterday since we were going to be doing this episode, and there's nothing about this album that I genuinely like. Um, and as there is like I know the guys in Cannibal Corpse, they had like a thrash band, and there's still a little bit of thrash influence on this album. And the one that came after it, I think it was Vile. No, not Vile. It was Tomb of the Mutilated. That's where they really double down on just the sheer knuckleheadedness, and that's where you do have like kind of like a rock format and song structure, and it's very poppy approach to death metal. This I feel that the Butchered at Birth is probably their most authentic expression, which isn't really saying much. So yeah, it's a D and between a D and a F for me. How about you, Shelley?
So yeah, we discussed this. So Tyler nominated Cannibal Corpse on our Slaughtering Sacred Cows episode. And in that discussion, I sort of mentioned I've not really listened to Cannibal Corpse all that much. Very early on in my journey into death metal, I was told to just avoid them by some very wise people, and I might have given Eaten Back to Life like one cursory listen, but it didn't do anything for me when compared to, Onward to Golgotha and so on. So I've just left them well alone. But obviously they're a name that is just in the death metal zeitgeist, so you can't really avoid them. But I have thankfully never really subjected myself to all that much. But prior to doing this episode, I did give this a listen, and I was checking out like reviews online and Metal Archive and so on. And it is odd to think where their reputation comes from, given that, as you said, Jason, this is their strongest album. A lot of the reviews alluded to the fact that they'd shed the thrash influences, but for me, this album is still alive with them. Not that that's a bad thing, thrash is still very closely aligned with death metal, but for me, it was just chug, 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 slow riff, fast riff, half tempo, double tempo, no kind of dynamics, no engagement. Asphyx are probably every bit as basic, if not more so, but there's an intent there. There's unexpected use of drone and doom and the guitar noise, and there's a more like ambitious attitude to how you construct a piece, whereas this kind of feels like content generation for its own sake. And then I got confused. It's like, why is this band so popular? Because in black metal, you could look at like Dark Funeral or Dimmu Borgir or Cradle of Filth and think, well, it's obvious why they're popular, because they're sugar coated. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of different influences of things that people like. Like, there's no mystery as to why these bands get such a following. But with Cannibal Corpse, there's nothing ingratiating about it. There's no creativity, but there's also no what's the word I'm looking for? No hooks, no like catchiness. You mentioned that they have a rock influence as well. It's like that might be true, but it doesn't really come through. And I just are confused as to how this band became so massive and so emblematic of death metal. But anyway, sorry, that was a bit of a tangent. I think it belongs in F.
All right. Yeah, I totally forgot about Eaten Back to Life. That was their first one, right? Eaten Back to Life.
Yeah.
And then this one came out. Yeah. Yeah. I liked Cannibal Corpse back when I was a kid, like, 13, 14, but didn't have any discernment. I understand their popularity because the songs are very straightforward in their construction, but not in it's very like the poppy version of death metal, I believe. And there is that overarching shock value with everything that they do. Is just make over.
Yeah, of course, there is the shock value. You only have to look at the cover art to think, yeah, okay. Back in the day when you couldn't research bands before and you were just browsing in a record shop, obviously you'd buy that album. So
yeah, and I remember, being 14, 15, reading some of the lyrics. I'm like, man, these people are messed up writing all this. And and I had like one because they had the censored out version of the album. I had like one of them was a censored version where the different artwork and censored lyrics and all that. So I presume Tyler will be placing that as an F, correct, Tyler? The Cannibal Corpse.
Without a doubt. When I was a death metal neophyte, I loved Cannibal Corpse, and I feel the reason can possibly be an explanation for why they're so popular. Nearly everything about Cannibal Corpse is skin deep. Their riffs are almost like a parody of the most basic idea of what death metal is supposed to be. Hell, some of the riffs from songs from Eaten Back to Life, like probably the most famous one, Hammer Smash Face, almost sound like a death metal gloss loosely draped over a Green Day riff. Um, and I think that also kind of goes into explaining their popularity. Cannibal Corpse is just a very clear signal to other people, especially people who don't like death metal or are unfamiliar with death metal, that this is death metal. It has shocking cover art. It has very deep, distorted death growl vocals. It has very down-tuned guitars. But beyond that, there's nothing. There's nothing else on offer other than announcing to others that you like very gross, very creepy death metal. And I think that's why they're so popular, because they're a way for fans of the genre to really sort of advertise that this is the kind of music that I like. It's really easy if you have guests over or something, you have your Cannibal Corpse albums on display. It makes a statement. And that was one of the reasons that I liked them, because I felt very transgressive by listening to Cannibal Corpse wearing their t-shirts and so on and so forth. But as I grew older, I realized there's no point in listening to this music. It on a deeper level, it does nothing. When you compare them to also simple group like Asphyx, Asphyx has a real understanding of the spirit of death metal and tries to communicate that through their music. They have an actual love or appreciation, so to speak, for a darker spirit, and for sort of exploring that darkness with their music. Cannibal Corpse, I believe, as radical or shocking as their subject matter can be, doesn't actually intend to communicate any kind of darkness through their music beyond simply, this is gross, this is disgusting. And they're doing that just simply to shock people, as we've all already said. So yeah, absolute F tier. This stuff is substanceless. It's terrible.
Oh,
Yeah,
wow.
you've actually really hit the nail on the head there. They're like your death metal starter pack. They've got the shocking covers, the guitar tone, the lyrics, and everything. It's like, here are the things that death metal are for your like basic beginner's guide or whatever. That's a really good way of summing up.
Yeah, and I think that's why there's so many people like Jason and myself and many other people I've met who have said, "Oh, I really liked Cannibal Corpse when I first got into death metal." Because when you first get into death metal, especially if you're very young, a big part of it, for better or for worse, is the excitement of exploring something taboo. And Cannibal Corpse is very obviously taboo, right?
They're like compared to other death metal bands, they're like the Disney version. I know the lyrics are horrible and the album covers are horrible, but it's so over the top that it's kind of like Guar, where it's comedic and all that. And you listen to like the interviews with these guys, and they're very humble, nice people. They're not out to do anything bad to the world. They just want to bang their heads, and make money doing it. So I do kind of view them as kind of like the rated G version of death metal. The Bambi of death metal, compared to like Morbid Angel, who was cutting themselves up on stage, and they truly believed that they wanted to summon like the elder gods and the ancient ones and all that, and they would be completely down for a demonic uprising, just destroying humanity in the Christian church. You don't get anything like that from Cannibal Corpse. Like you guys said, it's all surface level, not to be taken seriously. So yeah, I do kind of view them as like the kid friendly version of death metal, even though a lot of their albums became banned in countries and all that. But that's like Guar. It's like if Guar had the same theme, I think Guar would do the exact same results. So like now we have Carcass, who actually has like medical dictionary references for the lyrics, not just to gross people out, but to do it in a very clinical way. Necroticism, Descanting, the Insalubrious, I believe that's how that's pronounced. I got this album back when I was a wee lad, and I played video games with it on repeat over and over and over, and so I do have the sentimental side of liking this album back when I was a kid. But as an adult, as my taste matured and my discernment became more refined, I started walking away from the Carcass more and more. And a lot of people consider this album to be when Carcass became Car Crash. Um, and I'm sorry, Shelley, it's like your UK band so far is they're not holding up to some of the other bands in like the A territory, but it's a great band starting out. The first two albums are really great. This I view it as a competent album, but you can kind of tell the heart work and the commercial viability seeping into their sound. Eventually they did fucking Swan Song, which I wouldn't even call that a fucking metal album. But yeah, I would place it as a C. You guys may have a harsher opinion than I do, but just because I have spent a lot of time with it in my developing years, definitely don't hold it in complete poppycock territory. So go ahead, Shelley.
Yeah, I mean, I've got a very complicated relationship with Carcass in that they were one of the first like death metal bands that I got into, and it was through Heartwork, and I adored that album when I was much younger. When you don't have the frame of reference, and then I discovered, oh, they also played grindcore, and went back to Reek of Putrefaction, and like my whole life changed after listening to that album. I think it's one of the most splendid extreme metal albums ever made. But also, you listen to interviews with the members, and they say it was basically a mistake. They had no clue what they were doing. Neither did the studio where they recorded it. And Symphonies of Sickness was the much more authentic like expression. And I think Symphonies is the one album where Carcass were both in control of what was going on the record, and they produced a really compelling piece of like early grindcore. People hold this album, Descanting the Insalubrious, up as proof that Carcass can play proper death metal. I've been with this album for many, many years. I know all the members very, very well. Hell, even Arch Enemy, Michael Amott's other band, were one of like my gateway bands as well. I'm very familiar with his style and philosophy as a guitarist. And given all that background, this album is the very epitome of compromise when you're playing in a band. And you can almost hear it play out throughout some of these tracks where they want to prove themselves as a death metal band. They've improved a hell of a lot as musicians since the Reek of Putrefaction days. So they want to be up there with the big boys from the Tampa scene. Michael Amott, though, is still obsessed with Iron Maiden, Judas Priest, Saxon, whatever. And that would later play out in his career in Arch Enemy, but he was really pushing for that here. He was done with the Carnage thing. He'd sort of graduated from underground Swedish death metal, and he wanted to push death metal into the really melodic, euphoric territory of heavy metal. And then you have Bill Steer, who, just to come back on the Swan Song thing, that was the album they never wanted to record. There was a lot of label pressure going on there, and it ended up being a bit of an abortion, even by their own admission. But Bill Steer, he came from the British grindcore scene. Like, he'd played with Napalm Death, and he was almost a punk at heart. But the pressure in that scene was very, very anti-showmanship, very, very anti-guitar virtuosity. And I think in his heart of hearts, he actually really loved classic rock. He loved Led Zeppelin, things like that. And he wanted, by the time Necroticism was coming around, he was able enough to express some of that. And you later see this coming out in Heartwork and Swan Song. And then you have them, trying to align themselves with the Tampa scene. So all of these conflicting desires get put in a melting pot. And what you get is this album, which the older I get, the more I think it's frankly an absolute mess. Like, there are moments, there are riffs that I think that's a fucking fantastic riff, but then it just cuts out and they go to something completely different. Or suddenly this weird sort of almost like desert Judas Priest, like riding on a motorcycle guitar solo comes out of nowhere against the gore grind riff. Nothing knits together. It feels like a band that's literally just saying, right, I've had my bit, now you have your bit, and we'll just stitch them together somehow. I would rank it a D, just because, again, I've got a long history of this album, so I feel like, there is value here. There are some riffs that really stand out, but as far as comparing it to some of these albums, no, it's doesn't even sit in the same league.
All right, Tyler.
I think in his heart, Tyler's still in love with Reek of Putrefaction. Anyway, this album I would actually put under Heartwork in quality, not because Heartwork is a good album. It largely has no substance, but because Heartwork is much more aware of what it is and isn't trying to be anything else. Necroticism still at least has some very slight pretense of being a radical gore grind album, which it's not. At this point, Carcass has almost entirely abandoned extreme metal, whether it's grindcore or death metal, both musically and philosophically. The music, both in sound and in subject matter, is almost like protest rock, which is affirming of the individual, whereas most extreme metal, a large portion of it anyway, is about negating the individual. They use a lot of very cheap techniques that are immediately pleasing to an undiscerning listener. Sweetened glam rock guitar leads, bouncy sort of doubled rhythm Pantera riffs. This album is definitely where Carcass started to slide at a much quicker velocity downhill. I'm in the minority in that I think they kind of started that downward trajectory with Symphonies of Sickness, where they became almost a little too self-conscious, and there was some cuteness that had kind of started to work itself in on that album. A little bit of a tongue-in-cheek that was not meant to be parody in an almost gleefully violating way that Reek of Putrefaction was, but was almost more like, isn't this cool that we're talking about really gross stuff? But this album takes it to an entirely different level on the musical plane by utilizing the most obvious mechanisms that it possibly can. And I have no appreciation for it. I would not say it's an F. There's stuff that is much more obvious garbage that would be worthy of an F, like Cannibal Corpse. But I would definitely give it a D.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely agree about the Heartwork thing. I actually listen to Heartwork far more because, yeah, it is. You can hear the band at ease with themselves far more. Yeah.
And the melodies on Heartwork, at the very least, because it's aware, it's not as disjointed, and they at least have the benefit of being pleasing.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Oh, straight in with F there, Jason.
So if you're listening on Spotify, the Carcass is rated firmly in the D. I did give them a C, but kind of how I'm weighing it today, if two people agree on something, that kind of really skews how the tier is being distributed. But so I threw into the F category Death Human, and yeah, let me just say the 3 words, and then I'll hand it over to Shelly. Lack of comprehension. The worst fucking song I've ever fucking heard, by far. And I think at this point, yes, Death was in their prog. They were in their prog phase, just the beginning of it. But it's really salady. There's light jazz. At least the Atheist, the light jazz has some logic to it. There's no fucking logic in the Death. It's just fucking, okay, I'm feeling some vibes. And this might be the reason why OSDM is more than a vibe, more of a vibe than an expression, because this is what fucking Death is at this point. On Death Human, everything's so fucking vibe. Let's throw in some light jazz. Let's shoot a music video with I guess like an abusive mom, it's alcoholic. Let's talk about real world sociology problems. And yes, it's more of a it's a mess.
So Jason, often when we talk about Death, you refer to them as riff salad. Could you maybe elaborate on what riff salad means?
Yes, I can, Shelly. So riff salad, kind of like, you put a salad together, you just, throw in all the ingredients and you mix it up and you have your meal. That's kind of what riff salad is, but with guitar riffs, obviously. So there's just no forward fucking thought, no forward thinking in how the the songs are constructed as more of what sounds cool and the immediate where you're like, yes, this riff sounds cool. And then it's like you throw in another riff that sounds cool, but the way they communicate with each other, is really important. And Death does not have a seamless transition between riff to riff. There's always a disconnect somewhere, completely different colors and shapes that they're expressing through the music that don't really correlate with each other. And Death, like you can hear parts of that in like Leprosy, but Scream Bloody Gore is when the riff salad really came out in the Death. And by the time we get to Human, I don't know if Chuck Schuldiner was a weed head. He just smoked a lot of weed. He's like, yeah, man, I'm feeling this fucking vibe. And it's like, there you go, there you go. I have no idea what the fucking logic is behind his quote unquote prog, because a lot of prog is fucking riff salad, and this is a prime example of that. And I did speak a little bit about the lyrical content, where he wanted to make everything very personal and, kind of sociological in some ways, and, criticizing, aspects of our society, especially his fellow death metalers. He didn't have pleasant things to say about his contemporaries. Yeah, a total F for me. Shelley, go ahead.
Just as an aside, Jason said he was going to say 3 words, then handed over to me. No, that was actually interesting, because I'm not as familiar with Death as I think you guys are. Death are a little bit like Cannibal Corpse to me in that, well, no, I have more sympathy with Death because I do really rate their first 2 albums. Less so Spiritual Healing, and again with the prog stuff, as I alluded to with Atheist, listening to Death just makes me want to listen to Atheist. And yeah, with this, I mean, I basically concur with everything you said. Just to talk around Death a little bit, in that you speak to any contemporary death metal fan, they'll say Cannibal Corpse and they'll say Death, as like Cannibal Corpse is the meathead side, Death is the brainy side. And it is interesting. I know why we're ranking these albums so low, don't get me wrong, but it is interesting that we do so, because it feels like the modern narrative of death metal and the main commentators within the field are trying to sort of retcon a significance over these bands. And if you read some literature on like the history of death metal, you'd be forgiven for thinking that Death was like founded the scene within North America with their bare hands, and everything else is sort of a footnote to that. When actually Chuck, I kind of hold him as like the Euronymous of death metal, in that he was clearly very important for establishing the style in the mid to late 80s, for inspiring people. He marshaled a lot of people together. We already mentioned that Autopsy have a relationship with them, obviously very close relationship with the Tampa scene, but the actual output of Death does not hold up to any of their contemporaries by any measure. Like, not only does the work of Sepultura, Morbid Angel, Possessed predate them and outclass them, but in their progressive era, Atheist, Pestilence, we discussed at the gates as well, but in terms of like the brainy esoteric stuff, Death sound like an alt-rock band by the time that this came out. And you mentioned sort of the sociological, humanist aspects to the lyrics. Again, that's indicative of the fact that Chuck didn't really understand death metal. He again took the Cannibal Corpse route of, well, it's all just comic book gore, we're just messing around because we're teenagers like with a video game. Actually, I want to express something more brainy, which is indicative of him totally misunderstanding what the philosophy of death within death metal was, and his inability to properly articulate it. And again, very studied, very talented musician, but doesn't really have any understanding of how to communicate a profound message through that doesn't live in the shadow of its influences, whether that be thrash or whether that be progressive rock or jazz or whatever, or just his contemporaries that by the time 1991 had rolled around were far more in tune with what death metal was as an art form. I don't think I'd give it an F. I think I'd maybe give it a D, but yeah, very, very stale album for me.
Yeah, I tried re-listening to it, and granted, Death was one of my gateway bands, and I actually on my backpack in school, I had a couple of Death patches on it, and that was just before I had discernment. And the older I got, the more I realized is there's a disconnect here. And granted, I loved Morbid Angel back then, and it isn't just me growing out of these bands, and I still love Morbid Angel to this day. I can't say the same about Death. So yeah, I did have a strong liking towards them back when I was a kid, and probably when I first got into death metal, they were the ones who were up there with who impressed me the most. Of course, Morbid Angel, but an obituary, but Death was up there. And the older I got, the more the material does not hold up at all. And yeah, it's a strong F for me. How about you, Tyler?
I'm going to be the dissenting voice here. I have a much kinder view of this album. I would rate it a C. When it comes to Death's discography, I think that Scream Bloody Gore is actually pretty good. And I think that Leprosy is quite uninspired. I think Spiritual Healing is actually pretty good, and this album is okay, lot more okay than I thought it was for many years. I understand the criticisms of it, and it's definitely the beginning of Death's movement into the so-called prog territory that oftentimes more just amounted to a rehash of classic heavy metal, something that fools a lot of people, it seems. But I actually think it has a lot of powerful moments, and I think it benefited from the addition of some personnel from other groups. Who did they have? I think like the bassist and the drummer from Cynic on this record, who I feel did a better job on this record than they did on any of Cynic's material. But yeah, much more I guess less critical view of this album than you guys, but it's not something I'm going to fight for because it's not good enough for me to really go to bat for it. So I can settle for it being D ranked.
You don't want to die on that hill.
Exactly.
I firmly believe in 10 years from now, Tyler, the more and more that it'll just get on your nerves, just about the riff salad, the lack of vision. We talk about the lack of comprehension being the worst song, but there's a lack of vision and how the songs are put together. So yeah, the next up is the Dismember, like an ever-flowing stream. Yeah, I put that firmly in the S territory. This is the best Swedish death metal album, period. Go ahead, Shelley.
Christ, I thought I was going to have to fight for this being S. I 100% agree. I think this album is near perfect in terms of like Swedish death metal that embodies the Swedish sound. You know, the buzzsaw guitars, the D beat punk mixed with basically new wave of British heavy metal, and as Tyler already alluded to, the heavy influence of Autopsy. I think this album is absolutely perfect. It outclasses anything Entombed have ever done in their career, and Grave and Unleashed and anyone else you care to mention from that scene. And yeah, there are moments on this album, Dismembered being one, the opening track, Override the Overture, being another, where it reaches for the sublime. Like, yeah, it's a near perfect death metal album for me. Don't have too much else to say.
All right, Tyler.
All right, I know this is going to be blasphemy to a lot of people, but I listened to Carnage a little more than this album. But this album
No,
is still...
that's fair. The Carnage album is fucking class as well, but
yeah, but this album is still firmly an S tier, and also in some people's minds, I'm sure they're already thinking this. You're almost, in some ways, listening to kind of a continuation of Carnage by listening to this album, because several of the tracks on the Carnage album made their way onto this album, or some riffs, because they shared personnel. But that being said, this album is an S tier album. It definitely, as Shelley said, outclasses Entombed, who, while I understand their social significance in the Swedish death metal canon, historical significance as well, I think is overrated. They don't have as inventive and powerful and dark moments as Dismember does on this record, and honestly, in ways that I think are somewhat obvious, have a little bit more of sort of bluesy kind of melodicism at times that Dismember does not engage in nearly as much, except for maybe slightly on some leads, which were provided by the guitarist from Entombed, as a matter of fact. So yeah, S tier album. This album is just one of those death metal albums that, while it might not be the most experimental and really pushing the boundaries of death metal like Obscura from Gorguts, or even on this list, Blessed Are the Sick, especially the first half of it. Kind of like Autopsy, but turned up even further. If you want something that is just an excellent expression of the Swedish death metal sound, you should turn on this record and it will blow you away.
Awesome. Yeah, the Dismember, I've always loved Dismember. And I've had a love-hate relationship with other Swedish bands, death metal bands. Oh, and especially black metal too. Yeah, just Sweden in general, I have a love-hate relationship. And yeah, this band has not disappointed me that much compared to other bands. I understand that after this album, they did kind of go for the beer metal. And I still like the beer metal that came from Dismember. It's entertaining, and I'll drink some beer and listen to the beer metal. I'm like, yeah, this is a fucking catchy ass song. Can't say the same for Entombed. I feel that Entombed, yes, I think they were the first to use the HM2 boss pedal in that scene. But Dismember just utilized it way fucking better. Entombed, I always felt it was like death metal light when you actually get past that fucking aesthetic of the buzz guitar riffs, the chainsaw riffs. But yeah, I feel like this is kind of like, the Scream Bloody Gorish band of Sweden. It's kind of the surface level Swedish death metal, especially compared to Dismember, which brings the goods. And Clandestine, I'm gonna put that as a C. Just because I do view it's very, very average, and the Dismember does blow it away. How about you, Shelley?
So I totally agree with the comments around Entombed being overrated, and again, there's possibly the sort of deaf Cannibal Corpse syndrome here, and that Entombed were incredibly formative, and I know that there were lots of members shared between Nihilist and Carnage and Dismember and so on, and they all formed like very important to the foundation of the Swedish style. But again, it's sort of like the bark was worse than its bite when it actually came to producing the goods. And yeah, as Tyler alluded to, you can kind of hear the germinal of the sort of death and roll direction that Entombed would take even as early as Left Hand Path, let's be honest. I think I'm in a weird minority that actually rates Clandestine above Left Hand Path, though. And I think part of that is the riffs are more distinctive. The vocal performance is insane. I know it wasn't what's his name? It was the drummer. I forget his name. The singer of Entombed, who sadly passed away a couple of years ago. But on this album, it was the drummer, and he delivers one of the most deranged performances on a death metal album. And I think that this album is more varied. There's more of a kind of intent behind it, whereas Left Hand Path, although it is, I'm not going to say it's not a classic or whatever, but it feels like a band still sort of defining the sound or sort of framing where they need to be. Whereas, as we've already discussed, Dismember was like the realization of that vision. I think Entombed Clandestine was like the follow-up to that. Not quite as good, but still a really, really solid album. So yeah, for me, I think I'd rank it a B.
Oh, really? Yeah, I apologize for mispronouncing Clandestine. I said Clandestine.
I think it's either or. I have heard people pronounce it Clandestine. I think I'm not sure.
The audience can chime in on that. Tyler, what would you rank this album, Clandestine, from Entombed?
Firstly, to answer Shelley's earlier question, I believe the name of the vocalist from Left Hand Path was Leif Erikson. He also discovered America. All right, bad jokes aside, allow me to draw a line in the sand in front of apparently Shelley and I and say to all of the screaming voices of rage out there, this album is a little better than Left Hand Path.
I don't like Left Hand Path.
Yeah, this album is better. It's a better album. It's got more violence to it. It's got less of a sort of a little bit oil and water separation between heavy metal elements and the death metal riffing. The vocal performance is superior, in my opinion. So this album actually is something that I do listen to on a rare occasion. And every time I listen to it, I think I'm pleasantly surprised in the sense of, oh, this is a somewhat good Entombed album. I listen to Left Hand Path far less, except for occasionally listening to the title track out of a sense of nostalgia, because it has that somewhat surface level, pleasing, epic moment in the middle of it that kind of gives you a very superficial, yeah, this is Swedish death metal, triumphant feeling. But other than that, don't really listen to Left Hand Path.
The Phantasm melody, right?
Yeah, exactly.
It's not even their melody. They ripped it off a movie.
Yeah, that's kind of speaks to the quality of the album, right? Yeah, so this album by Entombed strictly is one I listen to more often. If it comes to any material from that group, roughly, that I listen to with actually a good some degree of frequency, period, it would be the Nihilist demos, which I think are better than all of Entombed's material. But they also had different personnel, people who would later go on into other death metal bands like Dismember and Unleashed, and that might explain a bit why that material is of higher quality. But I would give this album a B, because I think it's actually a fairly decent death metal record. Not as decent as what we have in the A tier, but definitely not as bad as what we have in the D tier. And I don't know if it's quite average enough. There's actually some moments on it I rather like to give it a C. So I'm with Shelley, and I would say it's a B.
Yeah, I think that.
I honestly thought I'd be out on a limb there with the it's better than Left Hand Path, but I'm glad we agree.
No, I can't stand that album. Yeah.
Fair enough.
Yeah, it's like if I want Swedish death metal, I just listen to Dismember. Yeah, fuck all the bands. So,
all right, let's do Gorguts, and then I've got to take a piss.
Yeah, we'll take a 5-minute break after the Gorguts. That sounds like a good plan. All right, Gorguts, considered dead. I'm going to put it between an A and an S, because I view that the other S albums that are going to, be there. I know that Morbid Angel is going to be S. Dismember is obviously an S. I don't revisit this as much as the Morbid Angel and the Dismember, but this is fucking solid as fuck death metal, and perhaps Gorguts best. I do have a soft spot for Obscura. I view that as like, wow, it's completely from left field. This album has some left fieldish riffs in it, but you can kind of tell like they had something else brewing, in their minds that they wanted to express, and that's what kind of set them apart from their peers. And Obscura is when that fully became fleshed out. But yeah, I don't revisit it as much as some other classics that will be in the S tier. But yeah, a strong album. I would put it above the Autopsy. So yeah, between an A and an S for me. How about you, Shelley?
Yeah, I think this album kind of suffers from the direction, the left field direction that Gorguts took from Obscura onwards, and it's kind of forgotten that before Gorguts became an avant-garde metal band, they were a fucking excellent death metal band. Erosion of Sanity, the follow-up to this, is an absolutely fantastic album that I listen to all the time. I don't revisit this one as much. That's not to say that it's not a quality album. I think, again, it's just sort of buried in the legacy of me trying to dissect Obscura and From Wisdom to Hate, and sort of peeling over those Gorguts albums rather than actually remembering that, these guys were on the money as far as the technical, semi-progressive, esoteric aspects of death metal are concerned. I would say I almost view them as like the band I wish Suffocation were, in that I love Suffocation, but there's just a little bit, there's not quite enough melody and not quite enough going on there for me. I need something more than just the percussive bludgeon, as complex as Suffocation were when they were doing that. And they to some extent achieved that on an album like Pierce From Within. But this album is kind of where I wanted Suffocation to be in 1991 with Effigy of Forgotten. So yeah, I think it's absolutely fantastic, immersive, atmospheric, but also, mind-bogglingly technical and intricate as well. I'd probably put it as an A for me, but that's not a reflection of the album. It's more just a reflection of I don't think I can affirm. I'm not familiar with it enough to affirm it as an S. I think it's an A for me.
All right, Tyler.
I have a playlist of albums that includes things like Cemeteries and Evil Shade of Grey and Cathedrals, Forest of Equilibrium, Cadavers, In Pains, and a few others that I call Nighttime Journeys. And this album has a very honored place in that playlist. It's my personal favorite Gorguts album. Erosion of Sanity is also fantastic. And in some ways, just looking at strictly at singular aspects, I would say that Obscura pushed the boundaries of death metal more and deserves recognition for that. But this album has a very intensely dark atmosphere. It's wonderful for listening to when you're having to do a long drive in the dark. And it really kind of takes you to a very frightening and very sort of nightmarish landscape when you're listening to it. The use of melody combined with kind of as Shelley spoke of, the more bludgeoning percussive elements really creates a kind of almost progressive lowercase p, as Shelley put it, journey. And I think that this album deserves more recognition, even though it seems to be pretty well liked by people, because it, as Shelley said, gets somewhat overshadowed by Obscura. But it's a wonderful album. I actually agree pretty strongly with your rating, Jason. I think that there's some S tier albums that are a little above it in quality, but I think that it is a little better than many albums I would put in the A tier. So between S and A, I think is a perfect place for it.
All right, gentlemen. So that stays between an S and an A. And at this point, we will be taking a 5-minute break.
Welcome back.
I am back.
Yeah, glad you agreed with me on the Entombed. That was actually a conclusion I came to relatively recently when I revisited Clandestine. I thought, wow, this is actually significantly better than Left Hand Path.
Yeah, I think it's because people hold the left-hand path in such high regard. I was kind of like quite tentative about, am I out on a limb here? Because I just would rather listen to Clandestine. But
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It's interesting that.
it's fairly good.
Sorry, go on.
No, I was just saying it's fairly good.
Yeah. It's interesting that compared to like the black metal list we did, the black metal list started with like C and then things branching off, whereas this seems to be very polarized between D and F and then S and A. Nothing much in the C tier at the moment.
Yeah, I think that black metal is just I think with black metal there's so much more passionate opinions about the albums in some ways, both for better and for worse. To be honest, I listen to death metal more often than I listen to black metal, and that's not because black metal is lower quality in my eyes. It's just because that I often have to be in a kind of specific mindset to be able to fully absorb black metal, depending on the band. Whereas death metal is more portable, I suppose you could say.
Yeah, no, I know exactly what you mean. I think you alluded to it in the discussion of Burzum, where although we hold that album in very high regard, there is a very specific circumstance in which you want to listen to it. Whereas with death metal, because it's much less atmosphere focused, it's much less creating the mood, you can just sort of listen to the riff construction regardless. Like there is that artistry to death metal as well, but I can listen to Clandestine, say, on a broad daylight summer's day and still get a hell of a lot out of it than I would, say, Transylvanian Hunger, much as I love that album. Like, yeah.
Because black metal kind of aims to almost create a very, it's going to speak to the mind somewhat, and it can be almost emotionally exhausting to listen to it because of the depths that it can reach in its expression. Whereas death metal has more of a kind of energy of providing sort of, I don't know, amplification to whatever activities you might be engaging in. It's somewhat of a corny trope, but death metal can be something I can turn on when I'm doing chores or doing tedious work, and it will motivate me. Black metal, if I do that, I feel like I'm cheating the black metal of the impact that it can have by doing that a lot of the time.
Oh no, yeah, I don't think it cheapens the music in any way. Like, one of the reasons why I love an album like Unquestionable Presence so much is because it is the kind of album I can stick on and just listen to it and do nothing else but just behold what's happening. But I can stick it on if I'm doing if I'm at work and I'm doing something particularly like technically engaging or whatever, because the album has such an energy and such a flow to it that it kind of keeps me like pumped and keeps me engaged. And it's rare that you come across an album like that that works on those levels, whereas I couldn't really do that with an Emperor or an Iljan or whatever. I couldn't stick that on while I'm staring at spreadsheets all day, because it sort of works as a what's the word, a sedative almost to like intellectual stimulation. But
I think my perception with the Atheist may be skewed because of how much classical music I absorb. And when you talk about like musical content, I do like metal, and I like the ambiguous aspects of metal, and but the Atheist, I feel like they are reaching for a higher medium, and it just doesn't connect for me. And I think it's because I have delved so far into classical music, and I'm experimenting around with like Lisztian omnitonality. And I feel like the same type of approach that I have is not the same that the Atheist has. Is very jazz oriented and classroom oriented, whereas like especially Lisztian omnitonality, that's very personal.
Do you know who was not delving for a higher medium? Was Grave, when they recorded Into the Grave.
I already put that in the D if you didn't notice.
Yeah, which is the most boring piece of crap there ever was, like right alongside Cancer. This album doesn't try to do anything cool.
No, they're definitely the worst of the Swedish death metal bands. I've seen them live, and they opened for Morbid Angel on one tour, and I was not impressed. And the crowd, they love fucking the song like Into the Grave, and it was like, I don't understand what the appeal is. It's very hook and driven, and it's very like poppy. Like if I wanted a poppy song, poppy song structure, I would listen to Miley Cyrus or something. So
there's even a song on this album called In Love, which is just a love song over death metal riffs. But I'm going to be kind to this album and say, although it is basically the Swedish version of Cannibal Corpse, I think it's a C, just because I think it's so fucking fun. I actually quite like the meat-headedness of this album, because it is so blatant and it doesn't pretend to be anything else. I think it's kind of like almost like the Motorhead of death metal in a way, and then it's just a fun listen for me. But I accept that it might be in the B.
With you. Yeah, I can almost agree with you, because there are times I want to like this album because I like the aesthetic of something just being primitive and raw. But unfortunately, this album bores me. Every time I listen to it, it just bores me. It's just a lot of buzzsaw guitar tone chugging, like somebody listened to Entombed and Dismember and thought, this is easy, I can do this, without understanding what actually made that music good. So I almost could say, oh, maybe it's deserving of a C, but when I listen to it, I more so am thinking that it should be a D.
All right.
I won't fight for it. So
the Grave gets the D. A hard D. All right, so Immolation, Dawn of Possession. Love this album. Definitely A territory for me. We've talked in depth about Immolation, and we have delved into the specific album during that conversation. But I do feel like Immolation has released stronger material than this album, and compared to the company, I think they do fit next to the Autopsy. side by side, not one better than the other. I do love it a lot. But yeah, Failures for Gods is definitely an S tier for me, and this doesn't quite compare, in my opinion. Go ahead, Shelley.
Yeah, again, I thought I was going to be in for a fight, but I completely agree with A. I thought I was going to have to talk you guys up from B or something, because as we've discussed Immolation before, Here and After and Failures for Gods come up as like their peak. Dawn of Possession is sort of where they were still finding their voice. It's a really, really fantastic debut album, but Immolation weren't one of these bands that came out with a groundbreaking debut like Altars of Madness or The Red in the Sky is Ours. They took a little while to find their voice, and they'd been around a few years before they came up with Dawn of Possession. There was see their earlier material on Stepping on Angels Before Dawn, where they sort of evolved from the thrash band Rigor Mortis into this sort of undulating, dissonant death metal thing, and they're still in that developmental process as Dawn of Possession was released. And they kind of fell by the wayside because they didn't release Here and After until 1996, which was long after death metal had had its day. They sort of had record label problems at the time. And I think this album, if they'd flown in with like within 1992, 1993 and followed it up, they would have been as big as some of the other sort of silverbacks of the genre. But unfortunately, it wasn't to be. But yeah, this album, really, really solid start for these guys. And they were already proving that they were very distinct from a lot of the bands that surrounded them. So yeah, very, very solid A for me. And again, one of the albums that's been with me nearly as long as Necroticism, and it's very dear to me, and I throw it on all the time, and it holds up, which is testament to it as well. So yeah, very strong A.
Cool, Tyler.
There's one half of this album that I think is pretty damn good, and then there's the other half that I feel Immolation falls into a pitfall that that a number of young bands can fall into, where they're not quite sure what they're doing and the music is a little bit disjointed as they kind of cycle through their influences. And for that reason, I'm a little bit conflicted as to whether to give it an A ranking or a B ranking. There's some records on here that I would give a B ranking to that I think are a little better, although I'll probably be in the minority on those albums, even within this list. But I did really love this album when I first got into death metal. And like I said, there's about half of it that I think is really good, half of it where they were kind of moving towards the style that they would fully develop on Here and After and Failures for Gods. So I can settle with it being an A, which it's going to be anyway, because you two gave it an A ranking.
Yeah. I mean, you could say it's a C, then I would have to use my brain to factor in.
But it's not that bad, so I would give it a C.
You could fuck with me if you wanted to, but I appreciate you being honest, Tyler. So Malevolent Creation. Wow.
Oh, where's it gonna go? Where's it gonna go?
So
this is one of the ones I feel like I'm gonna have to fight on a little bit, but
well, I think Retribution's better, Tyler, than the Ten Commandments. But yeah, I think Ten Commandments is solid for what it is. Definitely eclipsed by other Floridian bands around that same time. And yeah, the longward trajectory of Malevolent Creation has not really been a good trajectory. Actually, their last album was not that bad. Actually, there were some aspects that I thought were really competent. But Ten Commandments, yeah, definitely solid for its time, and yeah, definitely average territory for me. I do view that Retribution's a little bit better. But this is honestly a band that I have not really been compelled to revisit often throughout the years. And granted, I've been listening to death metal since I was 12, and I'm now 38. So that's a lot of time listening to death metal. And yeah, this album is competent, but yeah, definitely eclipsed by a lot of the other things going on during this time. So I think C is proper for its placement. Yeah, I do view it as better than The Grave, so, but not necessarily a B for me. I don't view it as above average. Go ahead, Shelley.
Yeah, the Scott Burns, Dan Seagrave production line was really on it in '91. By that point, they were really sort of in their stride, and this is sort of emblematic of that. That's not to say that it's generic. I don't think it is. In fact, I'm with you, Jason, in that I've listened to Retribution far more because it's sort of billed as a superior album. But last night I revisited this in preparation for this episode, and fuck me, is it a good album? Like, it's seriously solid. Like, it's, again, we come back to this word percussive. It has this very, very intentional way of delivering rhythms that are just locked in with the riffs, but then it is able to flow them into some very, very intuitive, kind of loose melodic expressions, and the vocals are on point. And we talked about Entombed's Clandestine for vocals as well. I think this album competes. I don't think it's up there with the current sort of crop we have around A, but I would say this is a solid B. And actually, that surprised me saying that, because it's been a while since I've revisited this album, and I always viewed Malevolent Creation as like an also ran of death metal, which to some extent they are. But I think this album really, really fucking solid, and I don't want to do it down. I think it's at least a B for me.
You know what? I actually agree with that, because I was going to place another band in the C territory, which we haven't gone to yet. And I do view the Ten Commandments being a little bit better. So, yeah, I'll agree with that. Tyler, what are your thoughts?
Hooray, it ended up where I wanted it. Yeah, I would give this record a B. It's a really good death metal record. I was really big fan of Malevolent Creation early on in listening to death metal, and then I kind of gave them a break for a long period of time while I explored more profound or in-depth material. But when I came back to them in the last 10 years or so, I realized that it's really solid death metal. It's really well made. It really scratches that itch to listen to something that's just a competent, well put together death metal record. This is my personal favorite from them. I don't really listen to Retribution that much. I've tried on a couple occasions, and for some reason I come back to this one more often. And they did a really good job. Malevolent Creation is weird in that a lot of their career, their early career was very solid, and then they had a spotty career later on.
And they started throwing around the N-word and all that, and
yeah, that stuff.
I'm surprised they only gave it a B, because they did say the N-word one time. So, and that's recorded on an album, not just in an interview or anything like that. That's like a statement they want through the band,
right? Yeah, but they would release.
Yeah, but we gave Burzum S last week, Jason. So come on, that's not a factor here.
They would release a slew of bad records, and then occasionally they would pop out one that wasn't that bad, like Envenomed came out after them releasing a series of records that were forgettable, and that one was like pretty decent. Or like Jason mentioned, their most recent record is pretty decent. So they're weird in that regard, but I'm really happy with their record being in a B. If we're going to put Clandestine as a B, I think Ten Commandments deserves a B.
All right, yeah. I probably was a little too harsh, because I do like Retribution a little bit more. At least I feel more compelled to listen to that album. So next up is Massacre from Beyond, the poor man's death, and death was pretty poor to begin with. So on this album, they do have three of the people from Death Leprosy, but not Chuck. But yeah, this is as cookie cutter as Floridian death metal gets. You can tell they want to just continue the style that was Leprosy, and make it even more accessible. There's not much going forward in terms of making profound statements. And I've met Cam Lee. Cam Lee has seen me butt naked because I was playing a festival in New York with the Go Craft, and staying at the promoter's house, and Cam and I were talking out on a patio about the old days of death metal and all that, and I had to take a shower, and the shower was right downstairs, and so I went and took a shower, and I left my clothes in a different room upstairs, and so I walked out butt naked, and there's Cam Lee. He wasn't done talking about the old school death metal with me, the old days of death metal. So I just continued the conversation with him right then and there in the nude. That's also when I was working out a shit ton. So I wasn't, feeling self-conscious or anything. Like, yes, I'm here. Let's talk about death metal. And yeah, regardless of that, Cam Lee, the figure, I love him to death. He has great vocals, and he did kind of popularize the Cookie Monster style of growling. However, this album just feels just so bland and so accessible, and there's nothing that when I go to a death metal album, I do like that ounce of something more to it, and this is just just bare bones. Shelley, go ahead.
Yeah, again, we seem to be lockstep on this. I thought, I'm gonna have to rate this a C because the other guys are gonna rate it higher, so I'm gonna have to really fight for doing it down. But no, we put it straight in where I'd have put it. Like Massacre, another of these bands where you're told that you should like them, as in pay your respects to your elders. But again, when you analyze their actual output, it just doesn't hold up. And like you, Cam Lee is credited with being incredibly influential on that scene, and he's very important for the death metal vocal style. But that doesn't mean you have to revere the actual output of the band, especially when you compare it to what we've got here. And again, last year, I was lucky enough to see Massacre in Camden in London, the one and only London Death Fest. They're never going to be doing it again, but Massacre were one of the headliners, and they were fine. But Cam Lee fucked up the intro to Dawn of Eternity. Like, he got the crowd clapping and then started doing the hey, hey, hey thing, but he got out of time with the band, and then the band had to struggle to get back in time. And you kind of think later on that day, I saw Triumph of Death, which was, Tom G. Warrior recapitulating Hellhammer. And it's like, that's also really basic, but they're much older musicians that are just nailing what they're doing and like doing it really, really well. And just comparing them to Cam Lee, who just, okay, he is getting up there in years, but he looked drunk and he looked like a buffoon, and he gets all this respect because he has this huge legacy behind him. But comparing him to other musicians of his generation that are still out there doing what they do really, really well and really competently, he doesn't hold up. And the legacy of Massacre does not hold up. This is a boring ass album. I'd rather listen to the first two Metallica albums than this, actually. I'm going to go out and say that. Anyway, yeah, D, maybe even a D and an F for me.
You said C, D, and F. Okay, Tyler, go ahead.
I will fight the both of you over this record, and I will lose. Maybe I'll take out Shelley, but Jason will absolutely annihilate me. But I don't care. I still think that this record is awesome. I love it. Listen to it all the time. It's real, and I'm going to put my foot in my mouth because I said that Cancer sounds like Wasp on a bad day, and I do agree that there are a few Kiss riffs on this Massacre record. But that being aside, I actually think it's a really well done and inventive record for its style. I think it's a lot better than Death. I listen to it pretty frequently, especially more recently. I really like it. I would.
Oh man, this is Leprosy light. Come on, dude.
Leprosy is terrible.
Leprosy is not terrible. This is
okay. Leprosy is not terrible.
Yes.
All right, no, sorry. I'll revise what I'm saying. I went off a little bit of rant there. It's not an F album. It's between C and a D.
Well, you guys can give it whatever rating you like. I'm going to be outnumbered, and that's okay. I'll stand up for Massacre, at least on this record. And I would give it a B.
A B? Come on, Tyler.
A B? Jesus.
A B. I would give it a B. I really like this one.
You're supposed to be like the death metal aristocrat, and it's like this isn't,
we all have our foibles, Jason, and this record is mine. All right.
All right. So Shelley was between a C and a D. I was a D, and Tyler's a B. I'm just going to throw it into a C because we don't have a C album. Is that okay, Shelley? No, I'll put it between a D and a C. Tyler's smoking. Dude, it's like, this is Leprosy Light. Like, listen to Leprosy and then listen to From Beyond. And you'll hear that Leprosy actually inches out above the Massacre. But yeah, I think we'll all agree the next album is a F. Morbid Angel, Bloodstart is sick, and it's so stupid. The acronym for Bloodstart is sick is BATS. What the hell were they thinking? This is not Halloween. This is death metal. That's enough for Morbid Angel. BATS. How about you, Shelley?
Well, yeah, you might as well move on to Pestilence. There's no point even talking about it.
I'm joking. It's S tier.
Have you guys ever heard of that really good band, Morbid Angel?
Morbid Angel?
I heard.
You know, guys, I seem to remember a little while ago we spoke about Morbid Angel on an episode for about 2 hours, or did I dream that?
No, I'm joking. This is definitely S tier. Actually, I think it's even better than the Dismember, but yeah. Okay, I do have an anecdote. And I think I might have said it before on this podcast, but the first death metal album I ever heard was Bloodstart is Sick by Morbid Angel. Alan Moses, who ran the Covenant of Death fan club for Morbid Angel, he worked at the private school that I went to. I had gotten kicked out of a couple of schools and landed at an alternative private Christian academy. And so, I would finish all my schoolwork the first hour of the day and go hang out with Alan Moses, and he would talk about death metal because I was into Metallica and stuff. And he was like, "Why you listen to all this sissy shit?" And he didn't even like Slayer. And but he brought in Bloodstart is Sick, signed by the entire band. And he's like, read the lyrics as you're listening to this. And I had my CD player there, the headphones, and I'm reading like the most blasphemous lyrics I've ever read in my life. Like, you know what? This is a good life. I enjoy being alive. And this was one of the most eye-opening experiences in my entire life. It just completely opened my mind to even more well-refined expressions of metal, which is I view death metal and black metal kind of equally. I'd probably put black metal a little bit higher these days, but when it comes to death metal, I do view it as the pinnacle of like mainstream type of music, where it's not classical or anything like that. These guys probably don't know music theory, but it was like there's so much fucking intuitive creativity that Trey Asgoth has. The lyrics are fucking phenomenal. The only quibble might be the production. It is a little sterile, but the music itself shines through it. And it's one of those albums that I've heard since I was 12 that I have never put down. I've always held Morbid Angel in the highest regard of all of extreme metal and metal itself. Maybe Celtic Frost, in different moods that I have, I might enjoy them a little bit more. But Morbid Angel is, since I was 12 years old, I'm listening to them as I'm 38 years old. Definitely the best of the best, and can't say enough good things about this album. And I would actually put it higher than the Dismember. So I'm going to put it as an S plus. I didn't know that category existed until just now, but I can move that up. All right, so S plus.
Oh God, he's gone rogue. Jesus. So yeah, I would rank it on par with Atheist, which I believe should have been S as well, but not easily. That's not true. It is my favorite Morbid Angel album. I discovered all of Morbid Angel's albums in chronological order, which I can't say for a lot of the classic bands of the early 90s. Me being 34, obviously I had to listen to them all after their glory days were long gone. So sometimes when that happens, you kind of listen to their albums out of order or whatever. But Morbid Angel, I saved up my monthly pocket money each month to go to the Guildford HMV and bought all of their albums, managed to do it in chronological order. So I listened to this after Altars of Madness. And as Jason alluded to, the thing that first strikes you is the production. Altars of Madness is quite anarchic and still very aligned with the sort of freedom of like early death metal in the late 80s, whereas Blessed of the Sick is like the first big budget version of death metal, and it was very inspirational for a lot of bands, not just the triggered drums, but the very, as Jason said, sterile atmosphere. But that is one of the things that I absolutely adore about this album, is that there is nothing disguising the exceptional musicianship and the exceptional talent of the compositions going on. Like it's completely bare. It's completely naked. There is nothing hiding the talents and the creativity of these musicians. And yeah, I know there's a couple of like keyboard interludes, a few flourishes here and there, but you're really kind of confronted with the raw kind of creativity behind the metal like setup. The two guitarists, drums, bass, vocals go, but it's delivered in this very kind of regal, very dignified way. It's very restrained. Like you come off the back of Altars of Madness and you release this, and you're straight into Fall from Grace, which is very slow, very plodding, very calculating piece. And they're not doing this in a way that's like trying to bludgeon the listener with heaviness. They're not incantation. There's a real kind of refinement and measured kind of calculation behind the delivery, and but it captivates you. In different hands, this album would have been boring as fuck because the production is so as you said, like digital and sterile and clinical, but because Trey and Pete and so on and they're so like locked in with each other, it captivates you and you can't help but just tune in to what they're doing. So yeah, absolutely S tier album. Put it as plus S. It is slightly better than like an Everflowing stream.
All right,
I think Atheist belongs up there, but
Tyler, what do you think?
Yeah, this album is exceptional. I had a friend when I was a teenager who was, when I met him, mostly into Gothenburg melodic death metal, like In Flames, Dark Tranquility. He also really liked Children of Bodom. Very talented guitar player. But I remember when I started introducing him to classic death metal, and I showed him this record, he made a comment about it that stuck with me. Listening to songs like Brainstorm, he said, "Wow, the guitarist here writes riffs that I would have never thought to write in a song. They're so creative, and I wouldn't have ever even thought to include something like that." And I think that speaks to the creativity of Trey Azagthoth on this record. The first half of the record has a lot of moments like that. The second half of the record is also strong. It's just rewrites of material from the Abominations sessions. But those songs still hold up. They still sound awesome. So, you can listen to the album front to back and enjoy all of it. But yeah, this record deserves its place, not just for being an exceptional death metal record on the whole, but also because it, like Obscura, because of that creativity I was speaking of, it really pushed the boundaries for what death metal can do. It was a very important record in that regard, and it deserves all of the praise and recognition that it receives. I would definitely give it an S.
All right. I also like with the black metal scene, they turned their backs on death metal, but they did not turn their backs on Morbid Angel either. So they acknowledged the genius of Trey Azagthoth, and David Vincent, he's up there in genius territory too, regardless of his other projects that he's been a part of that some people may not agree with. But when it comes to the complete presentation, this is the epitome of death metal in my opinion.
Well, I will say, like, his legacy is secure regardless, and we have discussed this at length on our Morbid Angel episode. But here, you like, as Tyler alluded to as well, sometimes it almost sounds like he's making a mistake or tripping up on himself, and then when you listen to it again, it's like, oh no, it's like he's just using a very complex rhythmic device or this chromatic interplay that's going on, and it is so unique. And the more you listen to it, like the more you're hooked by it, and it's just. Yeah, it's very engaging, but as you alluded to as well, Jason, it's a very intuitive way of writing riffs, where it's complex at first, but the more you dig into it, it's like, yeah, that works so well.
I always got the feeling that there is weight to the riffs of Trey Azagthoth. Like, if this was some, other universe where musical expression could turn into, like, changing the physical world, like, he would be building coliseums with his riffs. They have that weight to them. And phenomenal. I can't say enough good things about Morbid Angel. Of course, I know we have delved really deep into Morbid Angel, just a focus episode before. And they're honestly the only death metal band that I would actually go out and watch. Go see them live whenever they tour through. I've seen Morbid Angel more than any other touring band just because the music is so great. And I do love everything that they've done through Covenant. I like some aspects of Formless, and but yeah.
Well, we've discussed gateways, but let's move on.
All right, so I'm wondering, this is going to be one of those, like, I have no idea how you guys will rate this album. Pestilence, Testament of the Ancients, but it's a strong F for me. Strong F.
Whoa. Okay.
And
Right.
because it's so sparse, there's proggy aspects that don't really mesh. All the power from consuming impulse is lost on this album. It's a complete F for me. I don't know how a band could drop the ball this hard, but Pestilence did. Go ahead, Shelley.
Okay, so it's not like A or B for me. It's probably a C tier. But I don't think it belongs in F. I think, yeah, there was a lot of lost potential with consuming impulse, and they did jump on the progressive train, and they did not succeed in the way that Atheist or even maybe even Death. No, I think they're better at Death, but this album was definitely that like fabled transitional album that people often talk about, in that there was vestiges of the thrash band still going on. They were trying to incorporate the progressive element. They didn't quite know how, but what actually comes through is a really solid, like, very direct death metal album informed by this regal gothic undertone, and it kind of almost anticipates very early Septic Flesh in that regard for me, which is something in re-listening to it that I didn't expect to be saying. But if you go back and listen to this material, I think you'll kind of see what I'm talking about. None of that's reflected in the follow-up Spheres, but here you get this sense that they are trying to introduce this grandiose gothic horror. It doesn't succeed in that regard, but it doesn't belong anywhere near F. I think it's at least.
What about the album
C.
cover? The album cover's F, right?
Well, the album cover's just a standard Dan Seagrave. Like, I'm going to draw a, standard sort of horror, Lovecraftian sort of scene. Like Pestilence, again, we already discussed it. They're another product of, despite being from the Netherlands, they're another product of the Scott Burns, Dan Seagrave machine. And like, far be it from me to say that was a production line, because that many of the best death metal albums were produced in that complex. But Pestilence were one of these bands that tried to ride on the coattails of that, much like Cancer did as well, in that their quality was not quite up to the standards of the supporting staff around them. But this album itself, I think it belongs between a C and a B for me.
I don't see how. Go ahead, Tyler.
I would give this album a D. Actually, a lot of my feelings about this album parallel my feelings about Necroticism. I think that Pestilence imagined that they were advancing with this album, but in reality regressed. They have a lot of expectation-based riffing that I find a little cheap and obvious, and they also try to somewhat counterbalance that expectation-based rhythm with depth and harmony. There are some good aspects of the album, but I do agree with you, Jason, in that the attempt to fold in progressive influences was badly done here. I think they actually did it better on Spheres, which I think is better than it often gets credit for. I would rate that album higher than this one. But here I think that they created something that was very lackluster and was disappointing in regard to the promise that they had on Consuming Impulse, which is one of my personal favorite death metal albums. So I would settle with this being a D.
All right. So yeah, I figure that averages out to a D. Shelley put it between a B and a C. I put it as an F, and you put it as a D, so that's D. Sentence. This was a band that I honestly had put off listening to for years and years and years and years and years. Yarno from Serpent Ascending and Desecracy, he told me that North from Here is one of his favorite albums ever. And so I gave that an honest listen, and I listened to it a few times. Um, I feel that North from Here is superior to what was it, Shadows from the Past? I can't read the title.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think it's better. Like I know we haven't gotten to Unleashed, but I think Unleashed is like the ultimate C band. I think it's better than Unleashed, but not as good as above average. Just from my personal taste, I understand that there are a lot of competencies in this band. They do have forward thinking when it comes to song construction, but it has never really spoken to me that much. And I did give North from Here an honest listen a few times just to try to get into it. And this style of death metal, obviously is very rooted in thrash. It really, I feel like you look at Morbid Angel, which took thrash to its logical level, the most extreme expression of it, and this is just kind of just carrying over like thrashy aspects and not really making them necessarily very extreme. They are presenting a death metal package, but it doesn't seem like you're cranking the dial to 11 and you're changing the expression 100%. This still feels a little bit rooted in metal that came before it. If that makes any sense, I might be speaking out of my ass. I don't think poorly of it. But yeah, go ahead, Shelley.
Yeah, no, I don't think you're speaking out your ass. I think there's some fair points in there. So to contextualize my views on this album again, we have to talk about North from Here, which is one of my all-time favorite death metal albums. I'd hold it almost on the same regard as I do Unquestionable Presence in this articulation of this angular, spidery death metal, but from that perspective of just Finnish weirdness, like Finnish metal. It's quite hard to encompass in some all-encompassing statement about like black metal and death metal. Like this Sentence are a wildly different band to Amorphis as Demolition and so on, but Sentence had their own unique corner, and I think that's one of the wonderful things about Finnish metal in general is there's no defining arc behind it as there is with, say, Swedish death metal. And North from Here is archetypical of that. This album is what our friend and colleague Raphael, who sadly could not join us tonight, but he would call it preparatory in the sense that you can hear the elements of what Sentence would become on North from Here on this album, but there's still those vestiges. Sorry, I've had about 4 beers. Vestiges of thrash, and to some extent, while I was re-listening to it, I can hear like Napalm Death Era and Utopia Banished. I can hear that kind of really down the barrel, grindcore infused death metal bleeding in. But you can also hear them trying to work with this very esoteric, idiosyncratic sense of melody and sense of almost like jazz-based flow going on. So this is like the ultimate debut album where they're trying to find their voice. Sentence are not, again, they're not a band that comes out right out of the gate with an Altars of Madness or whatever. They take a little bit of time to move their pieces around the board, as it were, until they can come out with North from Here. This album is absolutely exceptional, but it's still a band trying to find their way in the world. For that reason, I think maybe between an A and a B for me.
All right, Tyler.
This album has a place on my Nighttime Journeys playlist with Gorguts. I am really fond of this album. I do think that North from Here is also awesome for some different reasons, although in some ways it's also a development of things that they were doing on the debut. I think that it is a really interesting meeting place between the grinding riffing that is rather reminiscent of Asphyx, in my opinion, that kind of has a melodic edge, and then also developing that into the odd, gloomy, melancholic melody that a lot of other Finnish death metal bands were making use of, like a Dremelek on their debut or Demigod to some extent. So I listen to this album very frequently. I think it is actually a really excellent death metal record of its style, something with a more nocturnal atmosphere. And I would give it an A.
Wow,
I think that puts it on firmly on B territory, doesn't it?
well, you said between an A and a B, right?
I did, yeah, actually. So yeah, we're pushing it up further.
I think it's an A.
Yeah.
Yeah, the people have spoken. All right. Well,
The original cover is cooler than the re-release, though.
I have a feeling nothing's going to be in C today, but we have three more albums to judge here. Interesting how the events have unfolded. But yeah, so I actually got two ratings for this band, this album. So we're on Suffocation, Effigy of the Forgotten. Um, because of the slam riff, I would put it firmly in F territory because,
Jason, come on, mate. Come on.
well, I said I have two ratings for this. Okay, so I'm going to
All right.
first rating first. So one riff in the opening song from this album created a literal legion of dipshits. That was worst aspect of brutal death metal and all that. Like I when I think brutal death metal, I think about Deeds of Flesh. There's coherence there and their song construction and all of that, but the vast majority of slam bands and all that, they got the inspiration to create that micro genre from one little riff on Effigy of the Forgotten, the first song.
Jump, 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 jump,
Yeah.
jump.
Just walk around and do a circle pit and wear your hat backwards and have
That's
a
an F moment for you.
basketball jersey on and all that and go re and
What about all the slam riffs on Infester? Would that be F moments for you too?
I don't think Infester really influenced slam at all though.
No, they didn't influence it, but they do have slam riffs.
Yeah, but Infestors, like, I don't know. I always get this feeling like they were really like doped up on morphine or something.
So we talked about this with our discussion of Dark Throne in that Transylvanian Hunger influenced a lot of bad black metal and kind of they were rehabilitated by hipster black metal and stuff. But you can't lay all that at the door of Dark Throne when Dark Throne were when they were writing Transylvanian Hunger. So again, rate the album before you and not what it influenced. What do you feel about Effigy of the Forgotten itself and what Suffocation were doing?
Yeah, infecting the crypts is a definitely a great song. So I'll put it between a B and a C, honestly.
Okay.
Because you're speaking a little bit about how it's just very, very percussive and not much development beyond the percussiveness of it. And I totally agree with that. The slam riff that's in there, slam before there was slam, it really does kind of detract. And it's not an album I ever want to revisit again. Suffocation's a band that I never want to revisit again, and I did like them when I was a teenager. Yeah, but
okay, so
sorry.
I do have some sympathy with this because Suffocation, they held up in most sort of top 10, 20 lists of death metal, and like Suffocation are that band that you got into, and you when I got into them, I wasn't really aware of slam. I wasn't really aware of deathcore. Actually, no, I was aware of deathcore, but I wasn't really aware of slam. I wasn't really aware of like the New York hardcore scene that they were pulling from. I was, into Carcass, then Morbid Angel, then I was told to like Suffocation, and I was a little bit. I was left a bit cold by them because I was like, I can see how technical it is and how intricate it is, but it feels like listening to a computer kind of write music. And to some extent, I still feel like that. But I've grown. I've listened to a lot more music since then. And I've also grown to love what Suffocation were attempting at the time and how unique they were and how influential they were, not on the slam that we're referring to necessarily, but there was a certain breed of technical death metal. Like we've talked about Gorguts, for instance. I think there was a real cross-pollination between the more progressive, brainier aspects of death metal and a band like Suffocation. Hell, you look at the early photos of Suffocation; they're all wearing Atheist t-shirts. Like they had a lot in common, as it were. It's just that Suffocation were appropriated by a certain brand of sort of meathead slammer that kind of just said, that one riff you did on that one song, that's what you're about now. And I would hate that if I was Suffocation, a little bit like, you know, how any band is remembered for one song, like Motorhead are just remembered for Ace of Spades or whatever. I feel like this isn't the album for me. Pierced from Within is where Suffocation really married the romanticist element of death metal with the percussive, primal element that they were going for on here. I feel like that was the true synthesis and realization of the Suffocation vision. Here again, we see a sort of proto vision, but I absolutely adore this album. I think it is vibrant, it's full of energy, it's full of, as Tyler has said before, of the Norwegian black metal scene. It has that element of wildcat genius, which is just fucking outrageous at times. Mike Smith's drumming is exemplary. So I think because of that conflicting sort of relationship with it, I think it belongs between A and B. A, because it is an outstanding album in every sense of the word. B, because it's not the kind of death metal that I vibe with most intuitively. So yeah, that's my 2 cents.
All right, Tyler, what are your thoughts on Suffocation, Effigy of the Forgotten?
Suffocation gets a bad rap for its association with its imitators, and understandably in some regards, because they certainly don't mind their association with that group.
No, they're new vocalists. Which band? It came from like Discords or something like that, right?
Yeah, something along those lines.
Yeah, so they actually recruited like one of the imitator band guys to actually join the band. So
and they hang around with that group, and their later albums have kind of rebranded them into that scene.
I just wish, like, when they announced the band was dead, that they stayed dead, because I remember, like, in 2005, 2004, around there, like, they had regrouped, and it's like, hey, Suffocation's back, and they did a tour, and I went to that tour, and I'm like, oh, yeah, Suffocation is, fun, but they wrote this really shitty album, and unfortunately, I see
well, not to shit on Tyler's moment too much, but I think a big part of that was the what's the album with the terrible production?
Breeding the Spawn.
Breeding the Spawn. Yeah, I think they were kind of scarred by Breeding the Spawn, and that was one of their best albums, but it had such god awful production that they kind of were permanently scarred by that. So they kept feeling like we have to go back and write the perfect Suffocation album where we marry really fat, solid production with really fat, solid songwriting, and they were constantly trying to, rectify that part of their history. But by the time 2006 came around, their time had passed.
It had passed to a certain degree, at least within underground death metal, but there was a lot of the deathcore scene and the slam death metal scene and the brutal death metal scene that looked at them as one of the, if not the most legendary band out of the classic death metal canon. And I feel that in their later career, after reforming, they fully took advantage of that. That's the scene that they hang around in now. And I think that they're rather happy with their status within that scene. That being said, I think this record actually is phenomenal. I think it has a really labyrinthine sense of riffing that is very interesting, very enjoyable to listen to and put the patterns together. It develops into some pretty powerful moments, even melodically at times. They have a really good way of making a melody emerge out of the sort of percussive bludgeoning that you can see in similar effect on albums like Deicide's Legion, although I like Deicide's Legion a lot better. So I would actually settle right around where Shelley is. I would put it between a B and an A.
All right. The people have spoken. I think your votes outvote me. So yeah, I'll put it between an A and a B.
Okay. I've got 7 minutes left. Let's get through these.
All right. Therion of Darkness, it's an A plus for me.
Fair enough.
A plus. Very forward-looking type of song structures, very entertaining, great atmosphere. And yeah, Beyond Sanctorium is the pinnacle of this expression, which would probably be S tier for me. This is right beneath that. And I'm surprised. I revisited yesterday after about 20 years not hearing it. And yeah, phenomenal album. Can't say enough good things about it. This is when you want to create death metal. Look at what Therion did early on for song construction. These guys know what the fuck they were doing, where songs are going to lead to. They don't milk riffs forever just to say, oh yeah, I want the vibe in this riff or whatnot. I don't want people to understand it. No, they just move on logically to the next and next and next. Much like you would say with the Atheist, but they don't play light jazz. So A plus for me. Shelly, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I actually completely concur again. I think it was, I can't credit myself with this. I think it was a reviewer on Metal Archives who, in their review of Beyond Sanctorum, kind of mentioned how Therion are billed as death metal early and then symphonic metal later, but actually the symphony element of Therion was much more prevalent in Of Darkness and Beyond Sanctorum than later, which was basically, as we've discussed many, many times, pop rock Bon Jovi stuff with symphonic operatic textures over the top. Here, I'm with you, Jason, in that I hold Beyond Sanctorum as like, that is S tier death metal for me. No questions asked. Of Darkness is an album that I did kind of write off for a long time, not because I'd listened to it and not liked it, but because I just thought, well, it's just them building to their moment of triumph, as it were. But I revisited this a couple of times in preparation for this episode, and I was actually surprised again that it is a phenomenal album. It's not just Beyond Sanctorum first try, it's actually kind of Beyond Sanctorum in microcosm, and you can hear elements of the guys who they work in a grindcore band called Carbonized at this time as well, who are very eccentric, kind of, they're almost like a Swedish answer to Terrorizer, but maybe a bit more avant-garde in a lot of ways. And you can hear elements of that, but worked in with this dark romanticism that really blends in well with what they're doing. And it in many ways, it actually surpasses Beyond Sanctorum in the fact that Beyond Sanctorum has moments that are a little bit cheesy and a little bit too euphoric and a little bit too stadium rocky. And Of Darkness doesn't have any of that, but it has the same profound melodic exploration going on, but with the bludgeoning brutality of early Swedish death metal. So yeah, it's an exceptional album, and yeah, again, belongs between S and A. We're chiming a lot more than I thought I would, Jason, but yeah.
All right, to the good. The 7 minutes is now like 3 minutes. Go ahead, Tyler.
Yep, between an S and A is good for me as well. A plus. I listened to this record more than Beyond Sanctorum more recently, maybe because I've just listened to Beyond Sanctorum so much that I've kind of sort of completely absorbed it at this point. But as Shelley said, I think another reason for listening to it more often is that it's a really good marriage between the sort of progressive song structure and melodicism that they were doing on Beyond Sanctorum and straight ahead powerful death metal, and it makes it a really pleasant listen in that regard. It's a very frequent listen for me, so A plus I think is perfect for it.
All right, cool. And we all agree that the Unleash is definitely C territory. It's very competent, but there's too much focus on rhythm and energy that's the main focus isn't on songcraft. It's more just, the energy of the songs, and the riff structure is very predictable, very timely. Yeah, strong C for me. It's not bad, but it could be a lot better. So Shelley, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, you guys can keep talking after I've logged off. I'm just rushing through my thoughts and not being as succinct as I could be, but I don't want to be contrarian for the sake of it, but I really don't unlike Unleashed, and I think they're sort of like, again, they're the sort of Swedish version of Massacre for me, in that Unleashed are held up as one of the big 3 or 4 of Swedish death metal. I have no idea why. They are so boring, and so like route one with everything that they do, that I just can't understand why this band are remembered
It's
when
one
a
of their
band.
better albums, Shelley. It's one of their better
No,
albums.
I know it's one of the better. I know it's one of the better albums, and I fucking own it. It's in my collection. But I'm just like, actually, I'd I'd rather listen to Necroticism than this. Like, it's so route one and so basic. I'm just, yeah, it does nothing for me, and I can't understand why this is remembered when albums like, we were talking the other week about Crucifixion or Cenotaph or Infesta or anything like that, where there's these really complex, undulating pieces of death metal, but this gets remembered. Like, Asphyx does direct death metal, but in a very complicated, nuanced way. Unleashed does direct basic death metal, but it tries to ride on the coattails of the fact that, yeah, they have Viking themed lyrics because metalheads love to identify with their Viking heritage, even though most of them don't.
The early.
I despise this whole thing. I think it's D tier at best. I despise them.
Damn, that's ice cold.
Shelley. So a little known fact about Unleashed is the early Unleashed interviews. They did say a lot of edgy stuff, politically speaking, and they had a reputation of being very, very, very far right. So hopefully that's not skewing Shelley's perception of them.
Well, just so you know, I don't know who the members of I know who the members of Unleashed are, of course I do, but I've never watched those interviews. I've never had any interest in what the political views of Unleashed are. But yeah, as a Marxist, I don't know. My view is completely motivated by the music that's put before me.
Yes,
as we mentioned last week,
that's why I like you.
As we mentioned last week, I put Burzum in S tier.
I know, I like
you.
And
he gave
you feel guilty because of it. Oh, good times. All right, so Tyler, do you say it's a D too?
No, I would actually put it as a C. I don't necessarily prefer this record. I like Shadows of the Deep more, and I actually do legitimately like that album. I probably would give that album a B tier, but this album is pretty straight ahead. It has almost a Venom style of riffing at times, which I think was intentional. And so in that regard, it can be kind of boring compared to better quality albums, even in its tier of quality. So I wouldn't give it a D because I don't think it has as many outright bad elements as other D tier bands on this list, but I would give it a C.
Yeah. All right, cool. Yeah, we have our only C band today, and that was Unleashed. Surprise!
We did need one C band, I guess.
Yes. But anyway, just kind of chime in. I know you have to leave, Shelley. One of the reasons why I like you is that you have vastly different opinions than I do when it comes to like real world stuff, like politics and sociology and things like that. But we're united in metal, so that's why I view you're the perfect co-host. And I want to thank you for being a good friend. I know you have to leave. And that's Shelley from hatemeditations.com and Metal Legion Magazine. Definitely watch this on YouTube so you can see the tier list being made and see the monstrosity. We have two phalluses. It's like a double-dicked tier list. You see that? There's two dicks. But yeah, great times, great times. Thank you, Shelley. I know you have a baby to tend to and, family life to tend to. So thank you, Shelley.
Thanks, guys. This has been exceptional as always. Love to you both. I'll see you soon.
All right, later. And Tyler, do you want to say any last thoughts before we wrap up? What are your general thoughts of the double-dicked tier list that is before your eyes right now?
I'm actually pretty pleased. I think that it was surprising, considering some of our divergences on past tier lists or past discussions we've had, that for any disagreements that we had throughout the course of this episode, we mostly agreed on the placement of the overwhelming majority of these albums, I feel. And I think that they're right about where they need to be. I have a bit of a personal like for Massacre, but that being aside, I think everything else is pretty much exactly where prior to this episode, when I was grading the albums as to what I thought they should be, everyone's about exactly where I thought it should be. And also, I guess for a final thought, I think that this list also reveals how incredibly strong of a year 1991 was for death metal. You can see that besides like the obvious bad ones, there is a decent number in comparison to, like, for instance, albums that come out today of really high quality albums that came out this year. If you were a death metal fan this year, you were having a really good year.
Yeah, yeah. I think we should do 1992, 1993 at some point in time as well. Probably 1990 as well. There's so many great releases came out back then. And yeah, we see it's like, granted, Morbid Angel Blister Sick that's a fluke of nature. How good that is a fluke of nature. That's why I put it above an S. But yeah, this year we had the Dismember, like an Everflowing Stream, which is the best by far Swedish death metal album. And we were casting shade on Entombed, as the poor man's Dismember and all that, but I think it runs true. There's so many great iconic albums that came out in this time frame that, yeah, I think we should continue doing this. Perhaps going further back might be even more interesting, because that's when a lot of proto influences were in the bands, like they're creating more firmer statements within that would become like traditional death metal, as well as black metal too.
I think it could also shed some light on what the real legacy of proto death metal was, because that's a contested legacy, especially talking about bands like Death. And there's a lot of bands that I think contributed quite an amount to formulating death metal that don't get recognized as much, or if they are recognized, they're not done so for that specific reason as to their major contributions towards forming death metal, that deserve more praise and probably more explication as to how important they were. So I think that could be a really interesting discussion.
Yeah, yeah, I think we'll continue doing these tier lists, and and as we do them, we'll come to a greater understanding of how metal evolved, or extreme metal evolved with death metal and black metal, and all the pieces that came together to create the music that we love. So yeah, thank you for listening, and definitely subscribe the Hate Meditations YouTube channel, like the channel, click the bell and all that, whatever the YouTube stuff is. And thank you for listening on Spotify as well, and thank you, Tyler. I hope you have a great rest of your day, Tyler.
You too, Jason.
All right, cheers.
From dream to dream, we have always been like an ever-flowing stream.